Humanism has existed within the African American community for as long as there have been African Americans. If there is a message that Dr. Pinn wants people to hear, loud and clear, it is this one. Humanism has existed within the African American community for as long as there have been African Americans. Dr. Pinn, an African American himself and an atheist humanist, has a project. He wants to expand the self-identity of the African American community, which is predominantly Christian and theistic, to include the possibility of humanism as a religious answer to the community's questions. Humanism is understood to be a way of making meaning out of life that focuses on human problems and human solutions, which may or may not include a belief in God and often does not include a belief in God. Decades ago, Pinn writes in a 2010 essay, Joseph Washington proclaimed, "In the beginning was the black church, and the black church was the black community." And for quite some time, says Pinn, this statement went largely unchallenged within scholarship and public conversations regarding African Americans and their religious commitments. But, Pinn says, humanism has always been present in African American history, and today, African American humanism is becoming more visible as an alternative to the traditional black church. At the same time, Pinn has a second project, which is to expand the self-identity of the contemporary American humanist movement, largely composed of various skeptical societies, the American Humanist Association, the Ethical Culture Movement, and the good old Unitarian Universalist Association. Pinn argues that this predominantly white intellectual movement needs to make space for African American culture and concerns. Theologian James Cone, a black liberation theologist, said that the chief heresy of the white church in America is the idea that one can know God without knowing blackness. Anthony Pinn would perhaps argue similarly that a humanism that does not have space for the black experience and cannot learn from it is not humanism and is not long for this world. Now, Anthony Pinn had an interesting journey to become America's most outspoken and prolific African-American atheist humanist theologian. He and his family moved from the Carolinas to Buffalo, New York, as a part of the great 20th century migration of African Americans to the north. He spent his childhood within the loving community of the black church, an independent church that eventually became African Methodist Episcopal, AME. Pinn recalls that while the adults were absorbed in the worship service, the children passed the time in their own way. He says, we had our own way of entertaining ourselves. Each child on the row got a hymnal, and you'd close your eyes and open up the hymnal quickly, and you'd look, and the goal was to eventually land on the same hymn twice. And if you landed on the same hymn, it was a great joy, and then you moved on to the next challenge. The final challenge, he says, was going to the restroom and staying away for an extended period and being able to explain the absence. Now, sometimes this worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes my grandfather would catch us. All he had to do was look. It was just that look behind those rather thick, cloudy glasses, and you knew that was it. But childhood games aside, Pinn remembers the life-giving importance of the church for him and his peers, of the black church. Church was a space in which we could breathe, he writes, a space in which we could have a bit of comfort in what seemed to be a death-dealing society. It was a space apart, away from all of the madness. He says it was a space away from my grammar school teachers who really didn't give a damn about me. As long as I stayed out of trouble, didn't create waves, everything was good. It didn't matter if I learned or not. But this was a different space, black church, in which my talents were assumed and pushed. One day at age 12 in Sunday school, Pinn remembers the pastor asked all the kids what they wanted to be when they grew up. Pinn answered, a preacher. To which the pastor replied, good, we start next week. After that, at age 12, Pinn became a successful child preacher under the mentorship of his minister. His mother insisted that he have a proper theological education to back up his preaching, at which he was quite successful. So eventually he made his way from a local Bible school to Columbia University. There, as a young man, aged 19, he continued to preach as an ordained AME pastor at a local church with the assumption that he was bound for a life of ministry. However, as a young man doing ministry in Brooklyn, Pinn increasingly struggled to reconcile his religious doctrine about a loving and all-powerful God who was in charge all of the time with the pain and suffering that he saw in his community. Right, this was in 1982. The crack epidemic was well underway. And Pinn recalls, Bedford-Stuyvesant wasn't gentrified in 1982. It was an area deeply troubled by economic want and need, and people found ways to pacify that want and need. In the early 80s, crack cocaine was a way of doing this. Pinn says, I'm at church in the middle of this, and we're saying nothing that eased life for these young folks. I'm working with young people who are finding it easier to plan out their deaths than to think about a bright future. They're struggling with this in the basement of a church that believes it has the way. And Pinn says, I had nothing to say that really made much of a difference. In the face of this persistent suffering, Pinn's conception of God changed from that of an all-powerful being who did mighty works in history, a God who saved in history, to that of a still small voice who spoke inside people's hearts and urged them to act. But increasingly, he began to wonder if God existed at all. As a minister, says Pinn, I was obligated to have answers, and I didn't have them. I just had questions. Recognizing that he could no longer preach Christian orthodoxy with integrity, Pinn surrendered his ordination in the AME Church, and he enrolled in Harvard Divinity School because he was seeking a place where he thought his questions would be more welcome. And they were. He got a Master of Divinity, followed by a PhD in religious studies, and at the end of this journey, he was a confirmed atheist and a humanist. He still had a powerful interest in religion, but now he understood religion differently. Religion, he had come to see, was not about believing in God or worshiping God. Religion did not have to involve God at all. Rather, religion, thought Pinn, was about exploring the who, what, where, when, and why of human existence. It was about making something meaningful out of the raw material of our lives. It was about the question. Humanists, he saw, were engaged in a search for meaning no less than anyone else. Only they were unencumbered by creed or dogma, and they were free to find answers that might or might not include God. Well, if that sounds like a Unitarian Universalist way of thinking about religion, that is because it is. And Pinn has had a long-standing relationship with Unitarian Universalism as one approach to building religious humanist community. He served on the board of Meadville Lombard, in fact, from 2007 to 2012, which is one of our UU seminaries. And indeed, I got to tell you, I read a lot of theologians as a seminary student at Christian Theological Seminary, and Dr. Pinn is the only contemporary theologian I ever read who seems to be aware that Unitarian Universalism is a thing and that our churches exist, right? And he'll talk about the UUA as a thing. So it's always like a little treat to see our name come up in like a real live book written by a big name professor. I'm like, oh, we're there. So as a religious and cultural scholar now committed to humanism, Dr. Pinn began to look more deeply into African American history. And there he began to encounter deep strains of humanist thinking, but they were often not named as such. And the origin and impulse for African American humanist thought were different. So humanism in Western Europe came out of the Enlightenment, and it came out of the scientific revolution and the rediscovery of classical culture. That was its impetus. It was very intellectual. Humanism in African American thought and in African American history was more often a response to the African American experience of suffering. The question that confronted African Americans, oppressed as they were by the cruelties of slavery and then by segregation and Jim Crow and the whole American white supremacy system, the question they had was, how do you reconcile this tremendous evil with the idea of an all-powerful and loving God? And the answer to that, the answer to how they grappled with this, is very complex. Many black people uncovered for themselves within Christianity the message that they were also made in the image of God, that they had unassailable worth and dignity. And this was a life-saving, soul-saving message in the face of all of the forces that were bent on dehumanizing them. But then what comes next? How do you reconcile that dignity with the very real indignities that they were experiencing on earth? Well, in some strands of black Christian religion, particularly in the Reconstruction era, the focus was mostly on the life to come. Black people would get their reward in heaven. The white masters would get their reward in hell, hopefully, and it would all come out in the end. In the meantime, the message was to trust in God. Now, this is not a humanist message because it puts God in the driver's seat and it offers a supernatural reward in some other life rather than focusing on this life. In other strands of black religion, black Christianity, the message of Christianity fueled liberation. African Americans, convinced of their worth and dignity as children of God, saw themselves in partnership with God, working to overthrow an evil system and to free themselves. This is the strand of religion that says God has no hands but our hands, no feet but our feet. And Anthony Pinn identifies this as a kind of humanism. He calls it a weak humanism or shadow humanism. There is a belief in God, but the focus is on human liberation, human problems, and human thriving and striving in the world brought about by human effort. God's not just going to do it. We have to do it. Thus, African Methodist Episcopal preacher Norman Brown could write in 1935 in a journal called the AME Church Review, "A people's God is no bigger than their needs, no higher than their aspirations." Brown would say, "The only God that will satisfy is the God in you. If you cannot find God in you, it is useless to search for him in the stars." Right? Pinn sees this as a form of shadow humanism. And it's a strand that runs throughout African American Christianity, from its earliest days, stretching through luminaries like Howard Thurman and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., all the way to James Cone and the Black Power movement in the 1960s. It is a theistic humanism that lived and lives within the context of Christianity and the black church. But finally, there were African Americans who, in the face of human evil and human suffering, simply rejected the idea of God as unimportant to their lives. Maybe God existed, maybe not. What could you say about a God that permitted slavery anyway? The important thing was to struggle and to persevere and find meaning in a difficult world. And you did that by keeping your wits sharp and your spirit up. Anthony Pinn finds many strains of this atheistic or skeptical humanism running, again, through African American cultural history, especially in art and in popular culture. And the first place he finds it is in the blues. You've got the spirituals as an expression of Christian spirituality, but you've also got the blues with their secular, humanist, and this worldly focus. So there's a blues tune that goes, "I used to ask God questions and then answer the questions myself." Or consider this old blues song, "Our Father who art in heaven, white man owed me 11 and gave me 7. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, and if I hadn't took that, I wouldn't have none." So the song treats religious claims with suspicion, in the face of survival, with humor. Pinn gives other examples from popular tales. A chimney sweep named John Jr. laments that while black people are on their knees praying, the white man is figuring at his desk. What in the world are they praying for, he wonders? Trying to get into heaven? They're going to get there anyhow. There's no other hell than the one down here. And he concludes ruefully, "Look at me, I'm catching hell right now." Now, Pinn follows this strong form of African American humanism, strong because atheistic, into the Harlem Renaissance, where existentialist thinkers grappled with the problems of human existence without any reliance on God. The African American author James Well Johnson wrote, "My glance forward reaches no farther than this world. I don't know if there is a personal God. I do not see how I can know, and I do not see how my knowing can matter." Zora Neale Hurston famously wrote, "Prayer seems to me as an attempt to avoid by trickery the rules of the game as laid down." She said, "I do not choose to admit weakness. I accept the challenge of responsibility. Life as it is does not frighten me, since I have made my peace with the universe as I find it." From the Harlem Renaissance, Pinn sees African American humanist thought stretching through the civil rights movement, where luminaries like Bayard Rustin and James Forman were explicitly atheist, through the Black Power movement, which included Christians, Muslims, and secular thinkers, all the way up to the modern hip-hop culture he named in our reading, which includes many religious elements, but also artists who attempt to make a thoroughly secular meaning out of the struggle of contemporary African American life in the aftermath of urban neglect, the drug war, and mass incarceration. Dr. Pinn notes that African American humanism often has an emphasis on the painful and tragic aspects of life. It applies what he calls a nitty-gritty lens to the material of human existence. So its language and its subject matter are sometimes shocking and raw. Still, we have to be careful to distinguish this nitty-gritty humanism from cynicism or nihilism or indifference. It's not about not caring. These artists, thinkers, and activists are all determined to wrestle dignity and meaning from the challenges of human existence. And one of the particularities of African American humanism is that the challenge confronted includes a history and an experience of white oppression. So that the African American humanist tradition is always confronted with the reality of violence and the problem of liberation. Pinn says, it is important that African American humanism be understood as a tradition because it has integrity and depth. It involves cultural production and institutions. It is long-standing, and it has a certain oomph, he says, that needs investigating. And he focuses on tradition because he's especially wanting to dispel the notion in the popular culture that humanism is essentially a white thing. African American humanism, he says, is not African Americans trying to be white. It is African Americans trying to be free. Now, for a significant portion of the 20th century, African American humanist liberation had a home, a strong and vibrant home, within Unitarianism, and then within Unitarian Universalism. Pinn notes that our appeal to social justice, expressed in terms of accountability and responsibility, the commitment in our 7 principles to the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, this speaks to Black humanism. And the presence of African Americans in leadership was also a strong, encouraging factor. UU historian Mark Morrison Reed reports that in 1956, 10% of UU churches had African Americans in positions of significant leadership. That's noteworthy, especially for 1956. Unfortunately, in 1968, when Black UUs, inspired by the Black Power movement, demanded much greater self-determination within the UUA, they met a lot of institutional pushback. And in the conflict that ensued, many Black humanists left Unitarian Universalism, some for decades, some for good. Or, as Pinn puts it, there have been significant rough patches in the relationship between African Americans and the UUA. This includes issues with cultural exclusion and the default assumption that the white way is the right way, and a lack of urgency around issues of concern in Black communities. So today, Pinn sees humanism on the rise within the African American community. Some African American humanists and some African American UUs will form new communities outside of our congregations in shapes and expressions we cannot now imagine. There's bright, vibrant, creative, humanist and other traditions at work in the young African American community, and they're going to do things that we can't imagine now. But at the same time, with a renewed commitment within Unitarian Universalism to address these problems, and out of the brilliant leadership that we are seeing from a new generation of Black Unitarian Universalists today, our congregations could and should serve once again as a vital home for African American humanism. But if this is to be so, we would do well to consider what Dr. Pinn identified as the lessons in hip-hop culture that predominantly white humanist institutions need to learn. And the number one lesson is that substantive diversity means allowing the language, signs, and symbols of a community to change so that all of the participants in the community see themselves reflected in the life and the language and the look of the community. It means creating the possibility for real involvement. It means allowing people's lived experiences, however raw, real, or painful, allowing them to be spoken and heard and then to reshape priorities. Dr. Anthony Pinn is fond of saying that religion is not a belief, it is a binding. Going back to the root meaning of the word religio. It is not a belief, it is a binding. Dr. Mark Morrison Reed says the goal is to create a community where we can bind together our dreams, our hopes, our work, and our companionship, and in this way offer one another the chance to pour out one's lives for the faith, principles, and people whom we value and whom we love. This is certainly a humanist vision. It is also our shared Unitarian Universalist aspiration. May we be willing to be bound together in new and exciting ways that change this community and change all of our communities to be more inclusive of more languages and more symbols and more cultural and creative expressions of the values that we share. May this community and all of our UU congregations live into this shared dream. Blessed be. Amen.